Sam Walker, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brett. Great to be here.
So you got a book out, The Captain Class, The Hidden Forces That Creates the World's Greatest Teams. I'm curious, what got you looking into what makes great teams great teams? We're talking about team sports here, and it's all team sports, right?
Yeah, all team sports. Yeah, it was an old obsession. I mean, I think it really started when I was a kid, and I played on this little league team when I was 11 or something. And, we were kind of a crappy group. We won like maybe half our games usually, but one year, for some reason, we just won, and we kept winning and winning and winning. Same kids, no palpable difference. And I thought this was great. I loved it, and I thought it would happen again. I figured it was something that happened once in a while, but that was the only great team I ever played on. And, I never had that experience again. So it was a little bit of an obsession, but, it really started when I was covering sports for the Wall Street Journal. And I had this ridiculous job where I just kind of flew around and went to cover championships and big events. So I had a chance to see some of the greatest teams of the century. I mean, the Patriots, the Chicago Bulls, the Spurs, the Yankees in the 2000s. And, I really got this up close look at these teams. And something was weird, though. Something was really off. I knew how hard it was for teams to be great. But what I found was that, when I asked these players on these teams why is your team so much better than every other team? It was weird. They didn't really have much of an answer. They kind of shrugged off the question. They're just kind of like, they hadn't really given it a lot of thought. They didn't really think it was magical or special or really that different. And Tom Brady was the one who put it best when I asked him this question. He said, what he always says, he says, you do your job so that everyone else can do their job. And there's really no big secret to it. And I just was like, that seems weird because it's so rare to have a great team. Now, the other side of it was really strange, though, because if you asked a player, on a team that had underperformed or was really lousy, why the team wasn't good. I mean, it's like pull up a chair. It's 30 minutes of like this and that. And I realized that it was even though they're really rare, these dynasties were different in that it seemed natural to people. It seemed natural to be part of a great collective effort like this. It seemed like it was just it working the way it should, whereas the hard thing seemed to be being on a bad team. And it just didn't make sense to me. So I thought I would try to see if Tom Brady was right. Is there something simple? Is there some element? Is there something that just allows a group of people, a collective effort to work seamlessly? And if it exists, can I identify it?
All right, that's a bold, ambitious goal there. So to do this, you did some like data you did some crunching here. You had to figure out, okay, let's take a look at all the greatest teams in sports history, and it's not just football, basketball, baseball. You're looking at obscure sports here in America, like handball or field hockey. So, how did you go about compiling that list of great teams? What were the criteria?
Well, there are ways to do this. There are other ways to do this. And I went out and looked at all the other lists of great teams I could find. And some of them were based on data and analysis, but they just weren't complete. And I realized there's no way to compare most sports, every sport, because they're all so different. Some of them have playoffs and championships. Some only really compete every 4 years. I mean, it's just really hard to do that. So I realized two things. One, I just wanted to find the freaks. I just wanted to go to find the most incredible, freakish performances ever. And a lot of that was how you define freakish performance. And so I had to define it. And my definition was that it had to be something that lasted. I wanted to find a culture of greatness that sustained itself. So I didn't set the bar that high. I said 4 years. A team had to have dominated for 4 years. So that was the first thing. And then I said, all right, this team had to have played at the highest level of competition in the world. So, college sports in the U.S. fell out, of that and a lot of other sports. And, I wanted to make sure they had actually played against the best teams of the time. So a lot of teams from, early soccer teams in Europe fell out because they just didn't play each other with any regularity. So that eliminated a lot of teams. Now, the last filter was the toughest, which was that they had to have done something unique. I mean, if you're going to say you're the best team of all time, you better be the best team in the history of your sport in some tangible way. So you either had to have won like a string of championships or, a number of consecutive games, or have some record for longevity that had never been matched. So that was the last criteria. Now, there were 25,000 teams that I looked at, and this is every sport in the world since the 1880s and 37 different categories of sport. And after eliminating all the teams that didn't qualify, there were only 17 left. That was it. And it was 16 when the hardcover came out. Now it's 17 because the Patriots squeaked in this year. But that was it, and that was it. These are not necessarily the greatest teams of all time. No one can settle that argument. But what I had was what I believe to be a pure sample. I mean, these are all freak teams. There's no question about their greatness, and that was what I wanted to use. That was the sample study I wanted to use to see what they had in common.
All right, so the Patriots just squeaked on there. What are some of the other teams, examples that made the list?
Well, there were some that you might suspect. I mean, if you know basketball, of course, the Boston Celtics, the Bill Russell Celtics from 57 to 69, 11 titles in 13 years, right? They're on there. The Steelers from the 1970s, 4 Super Bowls in 6 years. The Montreal Canadiens, who won 5 straight cups in the 50s, they're on there. The Spurs are on there, for the comparable 19-year, straight playoff appearances and 5 titles. So some of them were, but then some of them were not that familiar. I mean, there were some teams I'd never heard of. And one of my favorites was the Cuban women's volleyball team from the 1990s. And I knew nothing about them, but they're the greatest Olympic team of all time. And they did not lose a match of consequence in 10 years. And they beat up on these huge countries, coming from a very small, kind of poor, politically repressed country, that had no real great tradition of volleyball anyway. So it was teams like that. There were a combination of greats and unknowns. It's what made it really appealing to me.
All right, well, maybe we'll talk about those gals here in a bit. But so you had these teams. How did you figure out how did you decide what was the determining factor? Was it talent? Was it coaching? How did you decide, suss that stuff out?
Yeah, that was a rabbit hole. I mean, I had the list of teams and others that were close, and I started just breaking them down. And what I decided was, look, I'm just going to go with my own prejudices, right? I mean, the first thing I thought it would be talent. They just had greater talent than other teams. And I looked at it and realized that actually a fair number, if not a majority of these teams, did not have outstanding talent. They were talented, but they weren't incredible. So that wasn't the common element. And the next thing I thought was, maybe it was tactics. Some of these teams were really tactically advanced, like this Hungarian soccer team from the 50s. I mean, they were geniuses tactically, but then some of them weren't. The Steelers in the 70s weren't that remarkable tactically, so that wasn't it. And then I thought maybe money, but no. In fact, the majority of these teams had, average money or even came from poor countries in international sports. And I thought it would be coaching. I mean, really, coaching was the thing I thought we were going to default to. But that was one of the biggest surprises, which is when you look at these teams, when they started their runs, all but one of these coaches was either someone with a lousy track record who'd been fired from a previous job or had very little coaching experience, or in some cases, no experience at all. And a couple of these teams actually changed coaches during their winning streaks and continued winning. So it's not that coaches aren't important, but they weren't the one factor.
So that's weird. So that leaves us to captains, like the leaders of a team. So this is basically process elimination. But I thought it was interesting. What makes the difference between, say, a captain and a coach? Because coaches, I guess, a figurehead, a leader. Captains are also leaders, so they're both leaders. But what makes the difference where it's like a team captain is the one that has more influence than a coach?
Well, that took so much time to really nail down, and I started that process when I saw that it was the captains, and it was clearly the captains. I mean, it was a clear pattern. All these teams, the streaks were defined almost precisely in some cases by the presence of that captain over and over and over again wherever you looked. And what I did originally, I wanted to figure this relationship out. So I started with Vince Lombardi, who was the best coach that I could think of. And I went out and met his former captain, defensive captain, Willie Davis, who's in his 80s now and lives in LA, and talked to him. And I talked to Alex Ferguson, the great coach in the UK, the soccer coaches that the rest of the world's Vince Lombardi, right? And I talked to a lot of people about this and realized that, we have a kind of skewed view, not just of what captains do, but also what coaches do. And what I realized is if you looked at all of these great coaches that we revere, whether it's Belichick or or Popovich or Alex Ferguson, or even Phil Jackson, if you look at their peak periods of success, what you see in every single case was that they had a captain just like this. And it was that partnership between them. And there's a lot of push and pull. If you look at those relationships, it's not boss-employee. It's really an equal partnership. Yeah, I wrote recently about Steve Kerr, who's doing the same thing, sharing power with his players and especially his player leaders. It's a partnership, and it's like a meeting of the minds, and you have to be willing to let your captain be right and to let his view prevail sometimes. So it's not the typical relationship we think of with coaches, but they're a huge factor, but it's really comes down to how they relate to the leader of the players.
Right. So I guess you found after looking at the analysis that whenever these teams had a lot of success, like that player, that leader was on the team when that happened. And I guess when they left, did things just sort of crumble and they just fell apart?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases it was 2 weeks after their departure. In some cases it was the next season or, a couple seasons later. But, the declines are pretty sudden. I mean, if you look at the overlay, it's really stark. But here's the thing. This is the important point, which is, I'm not saying that all you need is a great captain to be successful. Teams need a lot of things. You got to have talent. You got to have good techs. You got to have a coach. You got to have a combination of things that are already in place. The way I like to describe it is like the captain is the verb in the sentence, right? I mean, the adjectives, the nouns, everything else might be more colorful and more important to what you remember and to why the sentence works, but it doesn't work without a verb. It's that thing that gives it its forward motion. So there are a million combinations to greatness, but the only thing that has to be there is the internal player leadership.
Right. So it's necessary, but not sufficient.
Right. Exactly.
So what are some examples of these great captains? So you mentioned Bill Russell, the Celtics. I'm guessing Tom Brady with the Patriots.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure. Brady fits right in. And the Patriots also had some great defensive captains too, and Teddy Bruschi and Rodney Harrison. And they had a kind of a knack for finding them on both sides of the ball. But yeah, the captains were funny. There were some that you would think of, Jack Lambert of the Steelers and Maurice Richard. But then there were players on great teams, even teams I had covered, like Barcelona, that I didn't know anything about. And Carlos Puyol was the captain of that team. And if you know anything about Puyol, he's not the best player on the team. He's a strange looking guy. He's the last person you would think of on a team that had Messi, But over and over, you saw this pattern, and a lot of them were really unheralded people. And in fact, these captains were nothing like what I would have imagined. I mean, I didn't really think about leadership much before I wrote this book because I didn't think it was going to end up there. But I had this impression that the leader of the team was almost inherently the best player, the person who made the biggest contribution. I thought of them as being celebrities, with this magnetism and this sort of high emotion they played with. I thought of them as great, just incredible at sportsmanship and very diplomatic, good at diffusing conflicts inside the team. I thought of them as these larger than life people with obvious talent, but these captains were anything but. In fact, they were not stars, most of them. They were role players. They were not charismatic. They stayed in the shadows. They did not care about personal accolades, and they could be really difficult to manage. I mean, they pushed back. They created conflict inside the teams on a lot of occasions. And all those things were things I thought would disqualify someone from leadership. I started to realize that we really just don't have a good grasp of what a leader actually does inside a successful team. Not just a successful team, but a team that sustains that excellence over time.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people think, Michael Jordan would have been one of the great captains, but because he has all those sort of stereotypical traits that we think of a great leader: charismatic, talented, etc. But you kind of came to the conclusion, no, based on some of the criteria, which we'll talk about here in a bit, he wasn't a great captain.
He was not. In fact, he was really not a good leader at all, and he wasn't the leader of the team. So the Bulls blew me away because I had the same impression of Jordan, and he was a co-captain of that team. But if you look back, it's just unbelievable. Look at the day. It was in 1990, early in the season, and the Bulls got off to a rough start. At that point, Phil Jackson was a second-year coach. The Bulls had never won a title. Everyone was saying Michael Jordan's going to be the greatest NBA player who never won a championship. That was the knock on him. And after a really rough start, Phil Jackson very quietly announced that Bill Cartwright was going to be the co-captain of the Bulls along with Jordan. And this was shocking to people because Jordan hated Cartwright and it openly mocked him because they had traded his friend Charles Oakley to pick up Cartwright. Cartwright's not charismatic, bad knees, kind of a brooding guy, didn't care about getting any recognition. But the minute he did that, the problem on the Bulls was that no one wanted to buy into Michael Ball. All these kids, on the team just resented having to just play a game that completely revolved around one player. Cartwright was the mentor. He was the coach. They called him Teach. He was the guy who got everyone on board with this idea of playing this way. And the minute they did that, they started winning. And they went on to win, 65 games and then win their first title. They won 3 with that combination. So Cartwright was the guy on that team who provided these qualities and provided that kind of leadership. And I'd never noticed him before, had any idea that was what was happening.
All right, so let's describe some of these traits. And you've mentioned some of them, but we can go into depth that great team leaders or great team captains have. The first one you talk about is doggedness. So what's going on there? What is it about a player's doggedness and not necessarily their talent that helps the whole team be better?
That was probably the least surprising trait to me. I mean, I figured, if you're going to be a great leader, you're going to have that kind of relentless competitive nature. But they took it to a level that I had never seen, which is that it didn't matter if they were winning by 10 goals or they were down by 50 points. They had one speed in competition, and they always played at that speed. And Carlos Puyol, I mentioned, of Barcelona, was amazing because they'd be beating some terrible team 10-0. He's running around like it's the Champions League final, and his teammates were laughing at him. But there was that intensity, but beyond it, it was this ability to continue to play no matter what and to play at that incredible level. And the best example, the one that really just turned my head to the power of relentlessness was this guy, Buck Shelford. And he was the captain of the New Zealand All Blacks, which is this incredible rugby team that was on the list for two different units. And he was in this game against France, and the French were out to get them, and they were going after Shelford. I mean, they knocked out 3 of his teeth. They punched him in the head. They knocked him out cold at one point, and also kicked him in the groin in the middle of this game. And this is pretty gruesome, but after the game, they lost. It was the last match they would lose for 3 years under his leadership. But after the game, he took off his uniform and took off his trunks, and he hadn't just been kicked in the groin during this game. He'd been spiked, and the spikes of the French players' cleats had ripped open his scrotum.
Oh, God.
And I know it's gruesome, but a really important piece of anatomy was hanging out. I mean, there was blood all over his thighs. It was a mess, right? He had played through that. He just kept playing. And, he became this sort of overnight folk hero legend in rugby. But that kind of shows you, there was something almost maniacal about the way that they played and how tough they were. And what I discovered looking at a lot of behavioral psychology is that effort is contagious. And, effort is the perception that someone is putting in a full 100% effort is the one thing that can make everybody on a team work harder as a team than they would on the same task individually. So there's a contagious effect. And I believe all these captains, because they were so relentless, made everyone around them better.
Right. Yeah. You talk about social loafing. Typically when we work in groups, like if you did a group project in school, you know this firsthand. You typically someone else got it. Right.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. It's so true. It's called social loafing. It's this phenomenon they've proven over and over, which is if you have people do a task individually and then together as a group, they work about 70% as hard, in the group setting. It's just human nature, which is why it's so hard to find great teams, because teams aren't supposed to be good, because by definition, when we get together as human beings, we're inclined to not work as hard as we would if it was just us doing it. So that needs to be counteracted. And if you want to sustain success, over a long period of time, you need someone with that incredible relentlessness to keep them from having, one bad game, one bad night, and the whole thing can end, and that's, I saw that over and over.
Right, so great team captains lead by example with the doggedness. So this is a counterintuitive trait. that I thought was interesting was that great team captains test the limits of rules. So that was interesting since, as a kid in high school, we always thought like, oh, the captain of the football team, it's like the guy's like the paragon of good sportsmanship. But you found no, like good captains are actually kind of they kind of play dirty. So what's going on there?
This one is tough to explain to people, and it took me so long to get to the bottom of it because you're right. These captains would do things that were really not cool. They were either kind of aggressive or even violent, or they would, really break the rules or push them to the limit. And, Tom Brady is a great example with Deflategate, right? I mean, that alleged behavior, right? But when I saw that, I was like, that fit the pattern perfectly. So here's the thing about sports. We look at the rules of sports and we hold them in the same regard that we do the rules of society, but they're not like the rules of society. I mean, the rules that you don't break under any circumstances. But in sports, the rules are kind of subjective. And, it's not about whether or not you're breaking the rule. It's what the referee says. It's what happens in the moment, whether you can get away with it. So these captains, because here's the thing, they didn't care if people thought they were dirty players. They didn't care genuinely didn't care what people thought of them. All they cared about was the collective outcome for the whole team. And it's hard to realize that, but when you feel that way and you don't care about the public view, your attitude on the field is, what can I get away with? What's the ultimate edge of what I can actually get away with in this situation? And these captains were incredibly good at finding that line and playing right up to it. Sometimes they crossed it, but most of the time they were intelligent enough to know like where the line was, and they would use that kind of subjectivity that's built into the rules in sports to the advantage of the team.
So that's where the Cuban team really, or like the captain of the Cuban team showed this trait.
Yeah, I mean, in spades, and it was really amazing to watch. So the Cubans, as I said, were this dominant team, and in the Atlanta Olympics in '96, they were 6 years into this run, but they were really struggling. I mean, they were just down and defeated and tired, and they lost a couple matches early in the tournament in the Olympics, and it looked like they were done, right? So the captain of this team was this woman, Maria Luis, who's incredible. She's only 5'9", and she was a striker, and most Olympic strikers are 6'2", 6'3", but she just had this incredible vertical leap, and she was terrific. But anyway, she was the captain of this team, and they had to play Brazil. They made it to the semifinals. They had to play Brazil, probably the other best team in the world, kind of their heir apparent for the best team in the world. And they knew that Brazil could beat them even if they were playing at their best. So she came up with a strategy. It was a strategy of desperation, but she knew she had to do something. And the strategy was this. Look, volleyball, there's always a little bit of trash talk going on, but there's no specific rule about what you can and can't do. So she decided, all right, well, we're going to see how far we can push this. And she told her teammates that when they got on the court, they had to start shouting insults at the Brazilians. And they were like, well, what kind of insults? She's like, the worst thing you could say to another woman, like whatever, just empty the tank, right? So they start shouting these awful things at the Brazilians. The Brazilians, complain. They got a yellow card for doing it. But, over time, it didn't really have an effect at first. But by the match got really close. And by the fifth set, you could just see the Brazilians, they were in their heads. They were mad. They were overplaying. They were getting too unhappy when they made mistakes. You just see the psychology working on them. And finally, the Cubans beat them. And right after the match, I mean, the tempers were flaring. And a couple of players in the tunnel bumped into each other, and they just started throwing punches. And this turned into a all-on brawl, like for 30 minutes. They had to call the Atlanta police to break it up. And it was a huge embarrassment for the Olympics and for volleyball. So I was like, wait a minute, this doesn't work. Like, how's that leadership, right? That's not leadership. That sounds like thuggish. I went to Havana and talked to Maria Elise about this, and she was fascinating. She's like, she said, it's a show. It's a tool. It's something you have to pull out. Sometimes you have to do aggressive things in order to pull your team through. And it's not done out of spite. It's done with a purpose. It's not because you want to hurt someone. It's because you're trying to accomplish a larger purpose. And I talked to her teammates, and this is when it really dawned on me that this was a tool. It was a tactic, because they said that during the fight, there was only one player who was trying to break it up, and it was Maria Luis. So she went from that aggression in the name of winning. But as soon as they'd won, it was off. She switched it off, and she was actively trying to stop this fight from happening. And that's the difference. I mean, they don't carry it off the court. They might be aggressive and test the rules in competition, but off the field, all of them were incredibly quiet. That none of them ever got in any trouble. They were incredibly law-abiding people, and it's a hard distinction to make. And I'm not advocating this kind of play, but I think it's important for people who are managing teams and for coaches to understand where it's coming from. What's the motivation for doing it? Is it to win, or is it done out of hatred or animosity? And I think the more that we understand that behavior and where it's coming from, like the more likely you are to make good decisions about leadership.
Right. I mean, even for people who aren't involved in sports, like I think what this over aggressiveness, like pushing the limits of the rules, what that trait they're displaying is like disagreeableness, right? But disagreeableness in the purpose of a greater cause. So I think oftentimes there's a lot of leaders who think they're leaders and they want everything to be kind of kumbaya, but because everyone's trying to be so calm and nice, like you don't push yourself. Like everything kind of stays the same because you're not willing to engage in conflict and confront boundaries. And that's where that's where the growth happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And conflict is another thing that they kept displaying, and it was really important. And the thing is, there's two kinds of conflict too. I mean, there's a conflict that's really personal, where you just don't like someone, and the conflict is driven out of personal animosity, right? But there's a kind of conflict that's called task conflict. And researchers have done a lot of studies that show that on teams that perform together in real time, with a real outcome like a sports team, on those teams, task conflict is essential. You have to argue about the process the team is undergoing in order to win. It's how you play. And arguments like that can often be mistaken for personal conflict and the toxic kind of conflict, but they're not. They're fundamental to keeping a team together and keeping them winning. And you see them in all these great teams. I mean, you see it on the Patriots where Brady and Belichick argue. Popovich and Duncan used to argue like crazy. And now the Warriors, I mean, the Warriors and Steve Kerr constantly arguing about tactics and approach. And that's absolutely crucial for a team to sustain excellence.
All right. So another kind of counterintuitive trait of great captains is we typically think of great captains being leading from the front, being charismatic, sort of like a Michael Jordan type. But you found the great captains didn't do that. How did they lead?
That was a puzzling question for me because I didn't understand it. And it all started with Brazil because, Brazil was this great soccer dynasty from 58 to 70. They won 3 of 4 World Cups. And, I went to, I was like Pelé, right? Of course they had Pelé. And I interviewed Pelé, and to my great surprise, that he was never the captain. And he said it was never even a question. I didn't want to be. No one thought it would be a good idea. And the captain of that team, the primary captain, was this guy, Hilderaldo Bellini. If you never heard of this guy, never scored a goal in his entire career in Brazil. He was not even close to the best player. He was a central defender, a guy who, did all the grunt work on the field. And that was really curious. There were other examples like that. There was Carla Overbeck from the U.S. women's soccer team in '99. You think of Mia Hamm and Brandy Chastain, and these great stars, but no one's ever heard of her because she was like Bellini. She was a central defender. So the question is, how do these people lead? And I found there were 2 ways. One was that you can command from the back, especially in soccer, but in a lot of sports, because, by distributing the ball to your teammates and being very unselfish, you create dependency. Your star teammates need you to get them the ball and to set up plays, right? So that creates this dependency on that person. But beyond that, what I found that was fascinating is because they were self-effacing and they didn't care about how they were perceived. They didn't care about getting attention. They didn't care about individual accolades. Really, genuinely did not care. People understood that everything they did was for the common collective good of the team. So it gave them this credibility. And Carla Overbeck was a great example of this because she was like very vocal on the field. I mean, she would get right on somebody if they weren't performing well, weren't focused. And she would also be there to congratulate them when they did something well. But they all understood where it was coming from. And when it's coming from someone like that, who is not interested in themselves, has no ego at all about their performance, it's genuine and it actually has an impact. It resonates with everyone. So they were able to command in that way too. And it's counterintuitive, but that's what leadership really is. And the star of the team in this system is liberated. Is liberated from the idea that they have to contribute to leadership, and they can do it as they want to, but they're relieved of that burden. And everyone loves this player because that's the person who's ultimately going to run into the burning building, when no one else will. And knowing that person is there creates this comfort. And that's what Brady was talking about. It's not that difficult. You do your job so everyone else can do their job. That was what I think he was saying, which is on a team that's functioning right, everyone knows what their responsibilities are, but they also know that someone's got their back. And that in all these cases was the captain.
So you kind of mentioned that, but the way captains or the great captains communicate, they're not giving rah-rah locker room speeches. Like, it's very subtle, and it happens oftentimes like when no one's even paying attention or no one else, or the eyeballs aren't on them.
Yeah, I didn't believe this when I found it, but I started, because you think of how do you motivate a team, and there's the Hollywood version, which is you give a big speech, and we know about great coaches' speeches and captains who are supposed to have a silver tongue, right? And that's how you motivate people. And I was shocked because not a single one of these captains, not one of them liked giving speeches. Some of them never did it. I mean, they just did not do it, or they said they tried it once and it was such a joke they never did it again. And I didn't understand how you could possibly motivate a team that way. And the person I really decided to focus on was Tim Duncan, because Tim Duncan of the San Antonio Spurs, and this is an incredible dynasty that won for so long. I mean, no one will ever match the length of their winning streak. So Duncan, you've seen Duncan give interviews, right? I mean, he's just like a blob. I mean, he's no emotion or charisma or anything. And I didn't understand how someone like that could motivate teammates. So I spent a lot of time watching them play and watching them practice. And what I noticed about Duncan was he actually communicates a lot, but not in the way you would think. He was always working the perimeter of the floor. He was always talking to somebody one-on-one very intensely, and he listened as much as he would talk. He would use gestures and body language and his eyes to really communicate what he was saying. And it was this constant communication. And the Spurs are famous for how much they talk. And you see this. You see them on the bench. You see them on the floor. They're constantly talking. It's like an open monologue. And more than any other NBA team at the time. And that is what happens when you have someone like that, who's the leader, who is circulating, because it gets everyone talking. Everyone feels, like they can be heard, but also more accountable. And all the problems that come up over the course of the game are addressed in the moment. Nothing festers. Everything is open for a conversation. And that kind of communication is the same kind that has been proven to be really effective in business teams. There's always someone in there who circulates, and they call it the charismatic connector. It's the person who brings everyone together by talking individually, not giving big speeches, but one-on-one communication about the task at hand. And that's the same leadership style that Duncan used. It's also the same leadership style that Yogi Berra used. And Yogi Berra, if you think about Yogi Berra, was famous for being inarticulate, right? I mean, I can't imagine him giving a locker room speech, right? But that's what he did. He worked with everyone. It's how he communicated, constantly, democratically, and intensely one-on-one with people in the moment. And that's the key. You just need someone who's willing to put that kind of time in. And it's not the perception of motivation that we lean to.
So yeah, that's not your stereotypical leader stuff displaying here. How do these captains get selected? Like, do these guys like actively seek after the captainship, or like do their teams just naturally decide, no, you are the leader, and gravitate towards them?
It's funny. So many of these teams, I think they wound up with getting these people as leaders almost accidentally, because a lot of them were obscure and they came from places where there wasn't a great tradition of winning, and there weren't great talents. And so the person who assumed the leadership accidentally was actually the right person for the job. But no, in most cases, these people were chosen by by the coaches or by upper management and given that designation. There was one case, Barcelona, where the captain was elected. And it's very funny. You asked if they sought the job, and it was very funny because Carlos Puyol was elected the captain unanimously by his teammates, except for one vote, which was Carlos Puyol. He's like, didn't think he should vote for himself. He didn't think it was appropriate. And most of them didn't pursue the captaincy for prestige. They didn't believe they were entitled to it. A lot of them didn't believe they were worthy of the job. But the reason that they wanted it was, in the end, because they felt responsible for the collective effort and for the common goal. It wasn't about their own advancement or appreciation for their ability. It was because they knew that they were the one who was going to, as I said, run into the burning building. They were going to do that awful job, that bit of grunt work that no one else wanted to do. And they were, they saw it as a burden. They didn't see it as a honor. I mean, they didn't care if they had the designation or not, honestly. They really wanted to serve the common purpose. And they knew how hard that was. And that's not glamorous. And it's not fun, and that they wouldn't get credit. But all they really cared about in the end was winning. And that was enough for them.
Right. I've even seen that in my own life. Oftentimes, the leader that everyone looks to isn't the guy with the title, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, you see that in sports too. I mean, you see, Roy Keane, who was a great captain at Manchester United, said this about captaincy. He said, there's the guy who the public sees as the face of the team and the leader of the team. But, inside the clubhouse, it can be radically different. I mean, the actual hierarchy of the team can be completely different. And that person can be really a marginal figure inside the team. And yeah, you see that. I've seen it too. I mean, I started reassessing all the teams I've been on, and finding these people that I hadn't noticed before, who were playing that role very quietly and were content just that the group succeeded and didn't expect or yearn for any kind of acknowledgement. And those are hard people to find. That's the problem.
Right.
That's why we don't have a lot of them, because they're not obvious and you wouldn't notice them if you're not looking for them.
Right, because the people who end up in leadership positions usually are the ones seeking after them. But the irony is usually they're not the good ones for the job, the best ones for the job. Yeah,
it's true. It's usually, especially these days, I mean, it's really, most teams are either de-emphasizing captaincy or else they're just giving it to their best player, or it's become something that gets wrapped up in contract negotiations, like it's a perk that they throw in, and it's not really based on how they actually behave in the team setting. And yeah, I mean, it's weird. I mean, it's so easy to make a mistake, and it's such an easy thing to ignore and such an easy thing to mess up. And, if you mess it up, it's really hard to undo it.
So why are captaincies on the decline? I thought that was interesting. I didn't know that more and more teams are using team captains. What's going on there? What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah, there are a few different things, but it really comes down to economics. And, the main difference now is, if you think about the last 20 years, I mean, the amount of money that's poured into organized sports, at the professional level everywhere. I mean, it's astounding. And the real beneficiaries, as it becomes more of a commercial enterprise, I mean, it used to be you just had to win. That's how you made money. You won. You had to win. But now, the economics are different. You really need to put on a good show, because most of the money is coming from TV. And there's an element of like making sure that you're putting on a good show. And as a result, it's the sports business is more like the entertainment business. It's the marquee names. And on most teams, the marquee names are the coach and the star player. And that has become a different model. So there are these two power centers inside the team. There's the big star and the coach. And, those people are, in a way, kind of battling for control of the team. That's kind of become a competition. What's happened is you squeezed out the middleman. And all these great captains, because most of them weren't stars, they were those middle managers. They were the people who stood between the players and management. And they had minds of their own and independence and some autonomy, and they could take the best of whatever the players were doing and thinking and the best of what management wanted, and they could fuse them together and actually act out and find a strategy that worked. They were also the people who held the team together when things were bad. And that's the lesson, not just for sports, but for management. Because, middle management's kind of not cool in business right now. I mean, you have founder culture. You have this idea that you want the founders and CEOs of a company to talk more directly to the star talent. But when things go bad, that's when it falls apart because, managers overfunction. They're not on the field. They can't actually do anything. So they start to come up with bad ideas and overfunction. And the stars, they start looking at their resume and thinking, maybe I should just skip this place. Maybe it's falling apart. It's those middle managers who care about the team's outcome and not their own. And those are the people who in those moments will hold the team together. And they use these traits that I've described in order to do that. And I see it over and over again. It's when everything's about to fall apart. That's when leadership matters. It doesn't matter when everything's going great, or your stock charts, straight up, or your team's won 25 games in a row. It's when things start to go bad. And that's when you need these people.
I love it. Well, Sam, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the book?
Well, I have a website, bysamwalker.com, which has more information. And I'm also on Twitter at Sam Walkers and LinkedIn and Facebook. And you can read my columns on leadership in the Wall Street Journal, which just started a few weeks ago on the Journal site.
That's awesome. Well, Sam Walker, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Brett.
My guest today is Sam Walker. He's the author of the book, The Captain Class. It's available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find more information about his work at bysamwalker.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/captainclass, where you can find links to resources where you can delve deeper into this topic.